Yep. Hello, welcome to Regrettable Century and Varn blogs from Dong to Decadence series, and we will hopefully, knock on desk, complete Samir Amin's of Revolution or Decadence from 2018 in the monthly review, part of a book that he never finished, which is a kind of third world systems take on things. We have gotten through all of section 1, part of section 2, and we've been debating whether or not this has anything to do with Marxism whatsoever. We're going to try to finish that today. I am also going to put a little caveat in this for health reasons. And you guys may notice that my beard is gone. That is for health reasons, weirdly. We may or may not have a long hiatus on this. We record so far ahead that it might actually not affect anything, but we will definitely be taking a probably month or 2 month break on recording. But like I said, I've got so much of a backlog, the world may not even notice. So I'm just saying that in case they do. Not gonna get
you're a machine, man. You're a machine. You record like crazy.
Yeah.
We're always like, we got to record something right now, so we have something for 2 days from now.
Yeah, and we're like, I actually have like episodes once a week all the way into January, and we're recording this before the election. Which is good for this scenario, because like I said, I might be offline for a while. When we come back, we will be going through Aufhebung's critique of decadence theory. We're going to go into the ICC, that is the International Communist Currents theory of decadence, and then we're going to get into some conservative writers on decadence theory, because they're not all stupid, despite what you might think.
No, they're actually, in some cases, more coherent than some of the Marxists that we're reading.
Well, I mean, here's the thing, like, I feel like one of the things about the Marxists is they don't actually talk about the effects on actually existing actual institutions.
Yeah. Oh, that's the thing that the conservatives definitely try to do is relate to a reader who's not trying to not looking for some grand totalizing theory that they can speculate about, but how things are being affected, like in the now.
Right. And as a person who is a believer in capital T theory, I also do get frustrated with like leftists don't talk about education. They don't talk about domestic health care. They don't talk or they only talk about it as a suite of goodies that they gave up on the moment that Bernie Sanders capitulated or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, looking at the discourse around that article that you posted about how kids at elite colleges can't read, some of the comments that I saw about that, not just with you but elsewhere, were just totally blowing off the idea that there's anything wrong with education.
Yeah,
and they're like, the kids will be fine. This is all moral panic about nothing. I'm like, wow, you tell me that you have no idea what the fuck is going on in our education system without telling me.
Yeah, I mean, no, seriously, it's just a technological problem. No, it isn't. This is just a cultural problem. No, it's not. They intersect. You can't separate the two out. Blah 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 blah. But yeah,
I've got functionally illiterate students in my college classes,
and me talking about like why even liberal families are going to stuff like homeschooling, and not just silly stuff like radical unschooling, which doesn't have to be silly, but it's like, since it's been turned on TikTok and TikTok makes everything dumb. Talk about the decadence of our society.
Right. I mean, this is all very relevant to the decadence of our society. The United States having a constantly dropping in the rankings education system is a pretty good example of that.
Yeah, I mean, here's the thing: like the first bourgeois powers, France, England, the United States, have all had bad education systems for like not quite 100 years, but since the end of the post-war boom,
for sure.
But
about 70 years,
yeah, but we in Britain are collapsing faster.
Yeah,
it used to be like France, Britain, and the U.S. were all clustered together at like 15, 16, but we're just dropping through the floor, and Britain's following us down.
Yep.
I mean, Britain has a slightly more rigorous and coherent educational system than the United States does for a variety of reasons. One of which is it's federalized as opposed to our national, as opposed to our weird quasi-federal not system, whatever the fuck we're doing.
Our totally incoherent and adversarial system that makes sure that nothing is ever accomplished.
Right. I mean, we're so adversarial that it's like hard to do anything. But I've been surprised that when I talk about this, it's conservatives who agree with me, and like leftists will make excuses for it. And I'm like, as we've all said before, when is the left just to make you feel good about what's happening to you under capitalism? Why is it fucking good that you like? Why is everything normalized? Like,
well, when did Lasch write The Culture of Narcissism? Since around then.
78. I mean, well, the thing is, though, go ahead.
I was saying Lasch is talking about the new left, but I think it's more applicable to now than it even was to the new left.
Well, here's the thing. I would even go more than you. We're not in a culture of narcissism anymore. If you actually follow his analogy out, we're in a culture of total psychic devastation. Because Fordism was for him secondary narcissism. He didn't say this outright, but when he was describing the society of the 80s and the minimal self, he saw that as primary narcissism. Well, the next step in the Freudian schema is total self dissolution.
So are we in a culture of schizophrenia now then?
Maybe.
A culture of some cluster B personality disorder.
Yeah. I was about to say, like, it's just all cluster B now, all the way down. That's why when like Jordan Peterson would hit you with that insult, it stings, because even though Jordan Peterson's also probably a cluster B person talking out of his ass, like you're always like, yeah, but that is everyone I know. Nonetheless, let's get into grand theories that don't tell us much. We've gone through Samir Amin using his tributary mode of production to get out of the problems of basing all the assumptions of the modes on Europe. And we have the modes listed. We've already talked about ourselves. We believe that the feudal mode was not coherent, but it is meaningful to talk about. We've talked about that on No Royal Road a lot. But this tributary mode literally seems to encompass every fucking thing.
Right. It flattens everything out. And that way Marx doesn't look Eurocentric.
Right.
But of course it wasn't Marx that said any of this, so.
Right. And it's also like a negation of a whole lot of Marxism.
Right. And it means that it makes it so that it doesn't mean anything.
Right. Yeah, it's a way of it's basically trying to deal with the Asiatic mode of production without saying that, because it's a an unfortunate term. But in doing so, it just makes a new problem by just It's just not clear. It's not coherent.
Right. I mean,
and what happens when you let. Oh, sorry. I was just going to make a dumb joke about woke.
Oh, one thing I want to say about Samir Amin. I mean, we talked about this last time. he also isn't super, unlike a lot of the people who are anti-Eurocentric, he also isn't super like he was against Islamists and sided with like developmentalist liberals in Egypt, for example, and Senegal, and stuff like that. So he doesn't cut the way people think he would. For example, we have very mixed opinions on Hamas, to bring up something relevant to today. But the problem with this tributary mode, so his whole thesis is the West was backwards because it was politically divided, didn't have a centralized tributary empire. That it caught up and created a capitalist mode of production to catch up, mainly in England and France, but also in the Italian city-states. But that it has decayed back into a tributary mode. But then I'm like, well, then what isn't a tributary mode? Like if like this is not neo-feudalism, it's even broader, right? Like you think about our critique of neo-feudalism.
Broader, less coherent, less useful.
Right. So we get to this, and the other thing is he's talking in such grand generalizations, they're almost impossible to say anything about. I'll just read this paragraph at the end of section 2. Doubtless to the Roman Western case, it is not only an example of abortive tributary construction. He said the West was backwards because the Romans developed too fast, but couldn't develop a tributary mode of production. And so they collapsed, and then that led to capitalism 150 years later. We can identify 3 other cases of this type with its own specific condition. The Byzantine Arab Ottoman case, that's one case. So the all of the Islamicate world and all of the Eastern Roman Empire are seen as, and the Ottomans, which are somehow uniting them both, which, I mean, that sort of actually does make sense.
Well, yeah, depending on which period of time you're talking about, because once the Ottoman Empire absorbs the Byzantine Empire, it looks a lot like the Byzantine Empire because it takes over its civic infrastructure. But like not before that. I guess that's what he's talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say because he just gives us one massive case of 3 different empires that kind of work in succession. So I guess in the Roman Western case, we were talking about Christendom, but Western Christendom, aka Western Europe, and then the Byzantine case, we're talking about Eastern Christendom, then the Islamicate Arab world, and then the Ottomans. Okay. Then he says,
right, but like if you remember your, I'm sorry,
go ahead. No,
go ahead. Say, if you remember your Rodney Hilton, the difference between the Anglo-Saxons and the French was night and day, completely just antagonistic systems. You could not ever characterize them as having been the same sort of thing.
Right. And even when I've talked to Adnan Hussein about we talked about the Mediterranean, quote, world system, unquote. Right. And he mentioned how much the Sicilians in the English case probably brought over some tributary stuff from the Arabs because of their exposure to them in Sicily and in Spain. Right. Which I think actually fits with Hinton, but like it makes these grand generalizations about what the West was, and then like what all the Byzantine /Arab /Ottoman case is. And people who wonder how this gets sucked into like Samuel Huntington Dugan civilizational politics, can you get like that? This reads more like that than it does like Marxism.
Sure. And one of the things that always annoyed me about medieval scholars that were not Marxist is that they insist that every minute difference means there's a new category, so that you can't conceivably call it like the feudalism of the Loire Valley and the feudalism of the Eastern Holy Roman Empire. You can't call those feudalism because they differ in insignificant ways. But Marxists do the exact opposite thing.
Yeah,
right. The Marxists definitely do the opposite thing.
We're just like, there's no difference at all. I mean, to me, this is like a degenerated successor to some of the worst stuff we saw in the Soviet Union.
Sure. Yes.
It makes sense that it would be that, though.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, the Byzantine Arab case, the Indian case, and the Mongol case, so those are civilizational cases. Not. That's the other thing is I'm reading this. I'm like, what does this have to do with historical materialism? In each of these instances, attempts to install a tributary system of centralization were too far ahead of the requirement of the development of productive forces to be firmly established, which I think is a very fancy Marxist way of saying they couldn't centralize because for whatever reason, and that I think whatever reason's doing a lot of work here, they couldn't develop unified productive forces within the empire, right? But like that's true in most empires, frankly.
Right.
And you could argue they couldn't do it in the USSR either. So, like, in fact, Hillel Tickton did. So,
yeah.
In each case, the forms of centralization were probably specific combinations of state, parafeudal, and commodity means. What does that mean?
State, parafeudal, and
that's everything.
So
yeah, that's that sentence that deserves a follow-up sentence or paragraph or essay.
And how are those things mutually exclusive?
Right. Like, how is the state totally separated from commodities? That's the only reason we even think the state is separated from commodities is capitalism makes it appear to be so, even though that's not totally real. Like,
and
you know what else? It says they were probably specific combinations. So it's like this sentence it doesn't really do anything actually.
And are you going to tell me that like the Prussian Empire didn't have parafeudal elements?
Yeah, exactly.
Which was and are you gonna, and if so, are you gonna tell me that the Prussian Empire wasn't a state?
Right. I mean, like state, parafeudal, and commodity means even applies to like the French and English modernity. It applies to the Prussian Empire. I mean, it doesn't apply to the United States, although arguably maybe our rentier system in regards to like mining and sharecropping is parafeudal. But then at that point, like, what are we talking about?
Yeah.
Like I can make it work, but the fact that like this seems to be saying something, and then when I go, what is it actually saying? It's like, well, let's break down the state. So the government, I guess, because we're not also dealing with nation states yet. Parafeudal, so relations of obligation that are not the state exactly, but sometimes inform the state. In commodity, so trade played. Of course, it fucking did. That would be true for low subsistence hunter gatherers, except for the state part. I mean, like,
yeah. In fact, it seems like this sentence is saying the forms of centralization were probably varied. That's what it should be saying, because state, parafeudal, and commodity means are just adjectives, further descriptions of the previous description.
Did he mean pre-feudal?
I don't know. I mean, he said parafeudal, so I guess like also vague. In the Islamic State, for instance, and which one? But nonetheless, commodity centralization played a decisive role. Okay, but what role? What's the role? Like, so there is commodity centralization in the like the Umayyads and the Fatimids, etc. But what role? And why could they have centralization, but the Byzantine Arab, like, what?
Yeah, this is another sentence which should be followed by a whole separate paragraph or even essay, or else it could just be deleted.
Successive Indian failures must be related to the contents of Hindu ideology, which I have contrasted with Confucianism, as the centralization of the empire of Genghis Khan, as we know it, was extremely short-lived. Those are non sequiturs. What about Hindu ideology? I guess he's talking about something else he's written. And again, this sounds like civilizational ideological critique. not historical materialism at all.
I would even I am willing to even grant that there's possibly a confluence, a meeting of those two frameworks. But again, without a separate paragraph to explain how, then I would just have to assume that there's
the
not
unification of subcontinent Hindustan thought into Hinduism as a religion is a post-colonial phenomenon in and of itself.
Well, yeah.
So, like, what Hindu ideology are we fucking talking about?
Yeah.
Like,
I don't know.
This seems like I'm sorry if a student turned this into me, they would have gotten notes to rewrite this section because I don't know what it's saying, and like it seems like we should automatically know what he's referring to.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll be quite honest with you. This seems like exotic mystifications to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have no idea what he's trying to say here, and I'm not like clear on what he's referencing.
And he's not even like telling us what like I have spoken about. Okay, give me the footnote where I can go look up that essay. Where did you speak about it, dude?
Yeah,
like
yeah, I'm kind of surprised that there aren't a lot of footnotes here.
Are there endnotes?
There's some. No, it's not here. No, and I mean, I know
not
this
in
is
this.
Like, this is like I'm just like this just feels sloppy, and I don't think
like
all
fired off
missive sloppy.
Like this is a fired off missive which seems like it could be a Facebook post.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
It was like a blog post almost, and this was like is like an introduction to the book that we never got. So I mean, maybe that's part of it. I'm going to be charitable, but it's just.
Well, then my criticisms have to do with the editors then.
Right.
If you're editing the monthly review website and you're like, oh, this is a thing which deserves a footnote, you could just add a footnote.
Right.
All right.
For sure.
But no wonder people get Marxist-Leninism and Duginism confused reading. I mean, Jason, do you see what I'm talking about here? Because you're on the Duginism reading group too.
Yeah.
Like this whole like civilizations do this because the row of ideology. Not that I don't think ideology is important, but usually we don't give ideology causal significance for why centralization is impossible.
Right. It's always one precedes the other, and the ideology is always secondary.
One would think so, yeah, but not here.
I mean, that's what it means to me, and that's what it also means to all Marxists before 1999. What the materialist conception of history. That's what it means.
So let's get to section 3. Also, the first section is like way long, and the other sections aren't, which is also not a great sign. The contemporary imperialist system is also a system of centralization of surplus on the world scale, insomuch that the United States and China and the EU, mostly Germany, were centralizing production, and that this has low organic capital needs because of automation. I think I know what he's talking about. But again, I'm having to fix this for him.
Yeah.
Because this centralization operates on the basis of the fundamental laws of the capitalist mode. Sure. Although, okay, which are they? And in the conditions of its domination over pre-capitalist modes of the subject periphery.
Are there still pre-capitalist modes anywhere in the world?
Not anywhere of any consequence. Like, I mean, we've got like in deep Papua New Guinea and in the Amazon, right?
Yeah, and like maybe in like the Sahara and but in general, there's nobody, like even the actually existing socialist societies have to participate in the capitalist world market, even if they're trying to build an alternative one.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know who he's talking about here.
I have formulated a law of accumulation of capital on the world scale as a form of the expression of the law of value operating on the scale. I've actually read that book, but again, I'm not quite sure what he talks about here. The imperialist system for centralization of value is characterized by the acceleration of accumulation and by the development of productive forces in the center of the system, while the periphery and these are held back and deformed.
that probably was true, but I don't think it's true anymore.
Right, I was about to say, it feels like productive forces.
The basis of my contention that we're no longer talking about the same thing. Imperialism is maybe a different. It's a different thing than what exists now, and this is why.
So there's a Cosmonaut article about the definition of the proletariat versus the formal and informal sector by Joshua Lou McDermott, which I tell people to read, even though I don't agree with its Maoist conclusions and everything. But he makes a point in a letter that he responds to someone, Joshua Lou McDermott, about the three functions of deindustrialization. So industrial output's one thing you can measure and talk about industrialization, in which case industrial output has increased in all parts of the world. So there's no deindustrialization. The number of workers involved in industrialization, that has radically decreased in the developed world and even decreased a little bit in China.
Right.
And then industrialization as proportion of GDP, it has decreased as proportion, but only by 10%. So basically what you see there, if we put those things together, we do not see deindustrialization of production. Sorry, neo-feudalist. But we do see deindustrialization of the percentage of the economy that is obviously tied into industrial production in the West. We don't see that in China. And then everywhere, including the developing world, we see the decline of the need of high numbers of people in industrial production. That you can't conceptualize that just as centralization of value and accumulation of the means of productive forces. Right. Also, if you do that, then you should, the logical conclusion for Samir Amin is that China is an imperialist power by this definition.
Right.
And I know that they would not argue that.
No, not at all.
Right. But ironically, China is the most centralized and has the newest means of development of forces. Does it have what the United States has? No, but it's got a ton. And it outproduces the US. So and then we're second. And then Germany and / the EU is third. All right. Thus, we can see the further development of productive forces in the periphery requires the destruction of the imperialist system of centralization of the surplus. Why?
Yeah.
Not that I disagree with that, but why? This is this whole decoupling argument, right? But if decoupling was so obvious, why is it forced on people by the imperial powers, not the other way around? Think about it. Who decoupled from China first? We did.
Yeah.
And sometimes, when you decouple, Russia, it makes you develop, Russia under the Ukraine war, it makes you develop a military Keynesian economy and develop your domestic economy some because you're being shut out, right? But that's not something Russia asked for.
Right. They didn't want it. In fact, they wanted the exact opposite. They wanted further integration, especially with Europe. But I remember whenever the sanctions first hit and Russia closed down all the McDonald's and then shut off access to Facebook and Instagram and stuff. I was like, wow, Russia's getting instantly cooler. They're creating a utopia over there. That's a joke.
Yeah. I was about to say, some people actually believe that.
No, all they did was open Russian McDonald's and Russian social media. So it's not like they're doing anything better, just different.
Right. Which, of course, will lead to industrial development and produce a lot of GDP and actual wealth.
For sure.
But will also, since it's a closed system, will also be really given to inflationary and deflationary shocks, which we're seeing as well.
Yeah.
Unless and until they can export it into places that don't have that right now.
Right. But who's going to do? I guess India could. India has India right now is actually the most GDP productive major economy.
I think that's actually part of the gambit. Is that that's part of this
The BRIC system is the idea that Russian and Indian collaboration can overcome Chinese and Indian hostility on economic terms. But I mean, again, I think this was true for the 20th century, but like whenever I'm reading a lot of this third worldist literature, I'm like, are you describing the 1950s or are you describing now? Like there is a lot of deliberate underdevelopment that's happening imposed upon the world by the IMF. So that part of it I see, but the idea that we're still centralizing production forces, that's kind of true and kind of not, because we're totally integrated with these other and if we really take this seriously, this really does indicate that China is an imperialist power, which I don't think we would argue. I don't think Samir Amin would argue, but that is the logical conclusion of what he's saying.
Right.
I think that's, I mean, I know this is I'll try to not say this every time we pause, but it's part of my argument that for the last several decades, we're talking about we have been laboring under a different system of production and accumulation and circulation than was operative before and right after the Second World War. Like it's just different.
Right. I agree. But it isn't 19th century entrepreneurial production either, which is weirdly what a lot of people, even a lot of socialists, seem to want, which I don't even know why they do. But anyway, a necessary phase of decentralization, the establishment of a socialist transition within nations must precede the reunification at a higher level of development, which the planetary clash of society would constitute. The central thesis has several consequences for the theory and strategy of the socialist transition, aka it's the opposite of what socialists historically believed, which Samir Amin admits. I will say that in the periphery, the socialist transition is not distinct from national liberation. Of course, it's not.
That's quite the claim.
That is.
I have a different theory of everything, but I call it Marxism still for some reason.
Yeah,
it has become clear. Go ahead.
I say, and this right here folds over well into third positionism.
Yeah, it does. Which is why like my Maoist friend from 10 years ago who told me like one of the problems with Maoism is that it can easily become National Bolshevism, but people don't recognize it as such because it's brown.
Yeah.
I think
it's the good red brown instead of the bad red brown.
Right. It becomes clear that the latter is impossible under local bourgeois leadership, and thus a democratic stage in the process of uninterrupted revolution by stages led by a peasant and workers. This is just Maoism, but which form of Maoism? He's not even saying that.
Well, it's Mao Zedong thought as opposed to Marxism-Leninism Maoism.
Right. So it's not third world, except it is third worldism, but it's not the third worldism.
It's a new third world. It's third worldism part 2.
Yeah. Third worldism, world systems edition.
Yeah.
This fusion of the goals of national liberation and socialism engenders in a turn of series of new production we must evaluate. I have a question. Why don't we ever talk about the fact that most of the national liberation movements of the he says it under one thing. This later is impossible under local bourgeois leadership. But the problem is both Mao Zedong thought and Dungism encourage local bourgeois leadership. It's the fourth star on the goddamn flag.
Yeah.
People don't know what those stars mean.
That's what I've always said about Maoism and the national liberation movements in general, the red-colored national liberation movements in general, it is that it was the most effective and successful wave of bourgeois revolutions in history.
Yeah, which is going to make a lot of people mad. But I just think even if you think China is socialist, and I don't think China's achieved socialism, neither do they, by the way. But I do think we can argue that there's a real socialist core there. But nonetheless, it exists in the capitalist world. And for people who are like, what does it mean? Well, as soon as the Soviet split happened, how did they get their development of production? They didn't decouple from the capitalist world. No, they tried that in the 50s and 60s. They did the opposite. They totally coupled with the capitalist world.
Yeah.
You can't deny that. Like,
and I want to just to say that when I called them bourgeois revolutions, I'm not putting a value judgment on that thing.
No,
I think
it's not
the bourgeois
bad.
revolutions were good. Okay.
Right.
They just weren't socialist. They didn't create socialism. Even if they did try to, and I will definitely I definitely agree that they were all trying to commit socialism. Ultimately, they didn't.
No, and the only ones that kind of did were the ones that were shut out of the international system by not themselves. So the DPRK and Cuba, you know.
Sure.
And, for the emphasis,
I'm a big Cuba apologist, by the way.
Me too. And I've actually pointed out that China has lately been putting pressure on Cuba to liberalize, but market liberalize.
Yeah.
For the emphasis shifts from one aspect to another due to the real movement of society alternates between progress and regression, ambivalences and alienation, particularly in the nationalist form. Here again, we can make a comparison with the attitude of barbarians towards the Roman Empire. They were ambivalent towards it, notably in their formal, even Slavic imitation of the Roman model against which they were revolting. I mean, that's true-ish, but he's saying it in such broad terms, I actually can't say if it's true in every case.
Right.
I think for the most part it is, but like the rest of this is just rhetoric. For emphasis shifts from one thing to another due to the real movement of society. I know we use that from Marx, but what the fuck does that mean here? Alternates between progress and regression. Progress towards what and regression from what? Communism? Is that like, then say it. Ambivalences and alienation, particularly in the nationalist form. But then it can't be about communism because we see this all the way back in the Roman Empire. At the same time, the parasitical character of the central society intensifies, and some imperialist tribute corrupted by plebeians and paralyzed by their revolt. In societies of imperialist center, the growing portions of population benefit from unproductive employment and from privileged positions, both concentrated there by the effects of unequal international division of labor. The problem with that is that most of the production doesn't happen in the developing world.
Right.
What is the developing world used for? It's not used for cheap labor. That's why you have massive urbanization without industrialization in Africa and in Latin America. The global south is not the world's production workshop. That's China. It's pretty much only China and maybe now finally India after like 120 years of that not happening.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And
so what's he talking about?
Like, he's talking about
the Roman
colonialism.
Empire.
He's talking about colonialism. He's talking about like how all the rubber trees on the plantations in the Congo in the 1890s, but
or the Roman Empire. What he's talking about here is the Roman Empire, and like you're mentioning, so stuff that's at minimum 150 years out of date.
Yeah,
and maximum more like 1,000 years out of date.
So unproductive employment,
like 2,500.
Unproductive employment. Okay, one, I just want to remind him that people weren't that, except for soldiers, were not employed in the Roman Empire. Free labor was not the predominant form of fucking labor. This seems to be reading like. From a historical materialist perspective, this is irresponsible because it's reading the past onto the future and the future onto the past.
Right.
In ways that are
transhistoricization.
Right.
Yeah.
But, which also makes sense if you think his ultimate goal is to say everything's decadence into tributary production, and that's the normal form of centralized empire, I guess. But that has nothing to do with Marxism at all. Just fucking own the fact that you've left the tradition at this point. I guess the only thing is anti-imperialism, but even this, like, I'm not even quite like what he means by imperialism seems to be shifting all the time. Like, I don't know what form of imperialism we're dealing with here. If Roman Empire imperialism is the same as modern Western capitalist imperialism, which it isn't.
No,
like it doesn't work the same way.
Even modern Western capitalism is different in its imperialist ventures than it was 100 years ago.
Yeah. All right. Thus, it is hard to envision disengagement from the imperialist system and the formation of an anti-imperialist alliance capable of undermining the hegemonic alliance and integrating a transition into socialism. Well, the problem is, like, who's got, like, you guys don't like the Comintern, and we don't even have one anymore, nor do we even have a common forum. China hasn't done either of those things. BRICS is not mostly got socialist in it. What the fuck is going to lead to what you think?
Like, well, and the very last attempt at such an alliance was when Hugo Chavez mentioned, when he talked about the need for a fifth international, which never got off the ground, and which he even said, like, really, I hope we can do this someday. And that was 2000 and what? 10?
Yeah.
And now we've got Lula, the nominally socialist president of Brazil, trying to get sanctions put on Venezuela.
The nominally socialist extractive economy. Like, I hate to like point out, I think both those societies are nominally socialist, but
right. There was definitely a huge movement of people trying to create socialism in Venezuela.
Definitely.
But like, especially when Chavez was still alive. But I think that the project is soured considerably.
It's soured. And this is why, like, Maduro's just looking for, like, trading partners for their energy policy.
Right.
Because that's what their socialism was based off of. I mean, like, which, by the way, socialism on one commodity is inherently unstable, and anyone who studied any kind of economic system should know that, particularly if you're a fucking Marxist.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it's not like everyone hasn't tried it, including Norway. So, whatever.
Yeah.
All right. The introduction of the new relations of production seem easier in the periphery than in the center of the system. Is that true? Seems like it kind of is true, but then again, not really. Like, I don't know. In the Roman Empire, feudal relations took hold rapidly in Gaul and Germany, but only slowly in Italy and the East.
You know what? I kind of think that
I think that actually is true, but I'm not sure what he means. Go ahead.
I think I might think that that first sentence is right. It seems easier in the periphery than in the center, just because it's
because there's less old production, there's less dead labor you have to get rid of, right?
Yeah, right. Also because there are there are no barriers politically to like whatever violence is necessary to force a change. And I think that's again part of Trotsky's combined and uneven development. It's
right.
central to it. What's interesting, though, is that just like many other sentences, this is a sentence which should be followed by at least a paragraph.
Right. Like, this is stated as if it's obvious. And I'm like, I agree with you, Jason. I think it's true. But and particularly since we're talking about seems and not is, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
He's not actually making a statement about the actual ease of development in the periphery, because that's going to vary depending on where in the periphery you're at. But
and again, you could settle this with a footnote. You could just say at the end of that sentence, you could put like a one, and then at the bottom you could give a sentence explanation about why and a link, and that's it.
But this is not unique to capitalism. We got to see here. He's not talking about capitalism here. He's talking about any mode of production. In the Roman Empire, the feudal relations took hold rapidly in Gaul and Germany, the periphery, I guess, but slowly in Italy and the East, the core, I guess. It is Rome which invented serfdom, which replaced slavery. Is that true?
I don't think Rome.
Like,
Chris Wickham would have us say that Rome accidentally invented serfdom as it was collapsing,
right? In the West,
and that would
specifically,
right, and that would be like because like the latifundia was broken up into smaller holdings, and then they charged rents to their peasants.
How many slaves were in the Byzantine Empire, though? That's another question. I don't actually know. But I know there's a ton of slaves in the Arab and early Ottoman one, although there's less and less as the Ottomans develop.
I don't necessarily
become more of a technical position, actually. But go ahead.
I don't necessarily think that what he said about feudalism never taking hold in Italy is actually correct. I think that it transitioned out of it into a sort of free labor system earlier, rather than it never took hold. I'm not a Northern Italian guy. I studied French and German feudalism whenever that was my thing. Many years ago.
It only slowly in Italy. If it's only slowly, then it only developed in fucking Sicily and the South.
Which I know it developed definitely in the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, which was a Norman kingdom, right?
Right.
But even in the north of Italy, it did develop. But by the time of the communes, it had sort of moved to a rent system.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think this is the opposite of, we get super annoyed when liberal historians want to make like every tiny detail a sign that we can't talk about anything, but also everything's internally the same somehow.
Yeah.
This is the opposite of that, where I'm just like, I think what you're saying here is kind of true, but I'm not 100% sure on the specifics, and you're not giving me enough of a definition to even say.
Right. Like we might be nitpicking something that he's going to explain later in the book that was never written.
Right. Like it could be that this gets fixed in a longer text, because like I usually Samir Amin doesn't make me this angry. So like all right, blah blah blah. Today, but this going back and forth, like this tributary mode that he's using is actually interesting. Because one, he's arguing that we're not in a capitalist epoch right now. He said that earlier, but then he keeps on talking about capitalist relations today. Today, the feeling of latent revolt against capitalist relations is very strong in the center, but it is powerless. People want to change their lives, but cannot even change the government. Thus, progress occurs in the arena of the area of social life more than in the organization of production and the state. The silent revolution in lifestyle, the breakup of the family, the collapse of the bourgeois values demonstrated by contradictory aspects of progress. In the periphery, customs and ideas are often far less advanced, but socialist states have nonetheless been established there. Okay, where, though? Cuba? Sure. Venezuela? Not really, but kind of.
But also, like, Cuba really can't qualify as periphery if they are shut out.
Yeah, so who are the states? Who are we talking about? Right. China? China's not periphery. Even like the other like Arrighi and Wallerstein have to admit that China is at least semi-periphery at best. And I'm like, how is the most productive industrial society on Earth semi-periphery?
Like using basic, just accepted world systems classification of periphery. Periphery is like the developing world, not the Eastern Bloc and its former satellites, nor China. Right? Yeah.
Although they try to maintain that China is part of the
periphery is a. I mean, periphery. To be peripheral means you have to have a relationship.
Well,
you
they
are
keep on
tied
trying to say
a
that
center, and you have to do. Yeah.
China is semi-periphery, which was kind of defensible in the 1990s when Arrighi was writing, but the fact that they've maintained it to now is like, what? Like,
yeah, that just doesn't make any sense.
China is literally the core of industrial capitalist production.
And also, politically speaking, China calls a lot of shots, so it's in no way peripheral to anything.
That's one of the interesting things when people try to combine like this with multipolarity theory and like, oh, they're doing the same thing. No, they aren't. Like the other multipolar hegemons are not periphery by definition.
Right. I mean, that is the logical basis of multipolarity, is that there are other poles.
Right.
Poles are by definition not peripheral.
Right. Like, I don't see why this, like, even if you argue that they're not imperialist, which I think you're not correct on, at least if you're basing your ideas on what multipolarity means in Dubin or E.H. Carr, Hans Morgenthau, or anybody who actually wrote about multipolarity. It does not seem like you could say that you can't say they're peripheral.
Right.
Okay, so this is his critique of Marxism, although he's not going to call it a critique of Marxism. Vulgar Marxist tradition. I like how people invoke Marxist traditions without saying which ones they're talking about. But anyway, vulgar Marxist tradition has affected a mechanistic reduction of the dialectic of social change. I mean, I would say that's true for the Soviet Union. Harder to say that for Western Marxism if you think that's the evil villain, though. The revolution, the objective content of which the abolition of old relations of production and the establishment of new relations, the precondition for the further development of productive forces, is made into a natural law. Okay, by the way, the revolution in Marx is not initially, like, you don't start with relations of production first, actually. And actually, I don't think a single Marxist theory of revolution, well, maybe like actually ultra leftists would, but I don't know. What do you guys make of that? Like the very fact that like the Marxist tradition has transitional programs and min-max programs indicates that that's not true.
Yeah, I kind of think that this is it's a way of trying to retrofit the whole of what we can call the Marxist tradition to his developmentalist. To his new non-Marxist philosophy. Like even though they're not the same thing, they're trying to glom them on together.
Right. So okay, then we get his weird other thing. The application of social realm of the law by which quantity becomes quality. So we have an invocation of Hegel, but without meaning. The class struggle reveals its objective necessity. The vanguard, the party, is above the fray. Now, is this supposed to be vulgar Marxist, or are we supposed to agree with this? Makes and dominates history, is de-alienated. In what world is the vanguard party de-alienated?
I think, just to be charitable,
try to fix this for me.
I think he's trying to. I think it should read like this: the vulgar Marxist tradition has affected mechanistic reduction, and then also all of the rest of this paragraph. That's all what we can call the vulgar Marxist tradition.
Right, except I actually don't think he's saying that because of the last sentence. This is why like this. Goddamn, this needs an editor. The political moment defining the revolution is that the vanguard seizes the state. Leninism itself is not devoid of the positivistic reduction of Marxism of the Second International. Okay, so he's actually criticizing Leninism here. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, he's criticizing basically the whole of Marxism as the vulgar. I mean, and to his credit, that's true that vulgar Marxism is to be found all throughout. But again, like you just said, just an editor would help a lot.
Right, because like if like he's not saying he's not saying the party is de-alienated. He's saying that vulgar Marx is presented as de-alienated, although I've never known anyone who would actually say that. But
no,
they do act like it. They do act like
and definitely like 1930s and 40s pro-Soviet communist texts will argue that.
Interesting. It's interesting how this. I think it'd be interesting to know what he thinks about like all the productivist reductions of productive forces that come out in the monthly review now. Just 6 years from this. This theory that separates the vanguard from the class is not inapplicable to the revolutions of the past. The bourgeois revolution did not take this form, and the bourgeoisie co-opted the struggle of the peasants against the feudal lords. Totally agree. Absolutely true. Yep. The ideology that enabled them to do this, far from being the means of the manipulation, was itself alienating. Also true. See, also capitalism. Our bourgeois society. Yeah. In this sense, there is no bourgeois revolution. A term that is itself a product of bourgeois ideology, but only class struggle led by the bourgeoisie. It is a bourgeois revolution. There was a change in the mode of production eventually. it was gradual, but
the bourgeois revolution is what we can call class struggle led by the bourgeoisie to usher in the bourgeois mode of production. That's what a revolution is.
Or at times,
so I see what he's doing here. I see what he's doing here is if there's no such thing as a bourgeois revolution, just class struggle led by the bourgeoisie, class struggle led by a communist party, even though it's not proletarian, is a socialist revolution. Right?
Yeah, maybe so.
So it just retroactively cleanses lots of sentence there.
Right. We can speak even less of a feudal revolution where the transmission was made unconsciously. We have unconscious revolutions all the fucking time.
Yep.
If the mode of production significantly changed, like the Industrial Revolution was an unconscious revolution.
Yep. And the Agricultural Revolution?
Yeah. Right. Like, I don't know, all the revolutions prior, like, the only conscious revolution in Marx is the socialist one, actually. It's not even the bourgeoisie one.
Yeah, the bourgeois revolution was not conceived of as anything but like a rearranging of who was on top to better facilitate the way that's already worked.
Right. All right. The socialist revolution will be of a different type, presuming a de-alienated consciousness, because it will aim for the first time at the evolution of all exploitation and not at the substitution of new forms of old exploitation. I mean, yeah, thank you. At least that's the goal. But this will only be possible only if the ideology animating it becomes something other than the consciousness of the requirement of the development of productive forces. This is to say...
This will only be possible if the ideology animated it becomes anything. Like
so,
the idea that
here's the thing. I think I agree with him here.
Is dependent upon ideology. That's that's something I can't agree with.
Well, it depends on whether or not you agree with the political determinist error or the economistic error, which are the two opposed errors in our narrow path. But here's the thing: is I agree. I think if we bracket out whether or not ideology emerges from or is the cause of, I think I agree with this. But this is radically different than what he's arguing elsewhere. The socialist revolution will be of a different type, presuming de-alienated consciousness. I actually don't believe we're presuming de-alienated consciousness, but whatever. In fact, I would argue de-alienated consciousness is not possible until you get beyond the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right. It's actually the result of, or it's one of the results of the socialist revolution. It's not a precondition. It's he's getting it backwards.
Yeah, this has all the like. I agree with him until I think about what he's seeing as causal here, because it will aim for the first time for the abolition of all exploitation and not only a substitution of new forms of exploitation. But this will only be possible if the ideology animating it becomes something other than the consciousness of the requirement of the development of production forces. This is actually a critique of Dungism, I think.
Yeah.
You see what I think it is, actually.
Okay.
But that's weird, because he sure as hell ain't saying that outright. But, like, if you think about the way Dungists argue, this would be aimed directly at them. There is nothing to say, in fact, that the statist mode of production as a new form of relations of exploitation is not a possible response to the requirements of this development. Ultimately, though, you're right, Chris. Even though he's saying a bunch of stuff I am saying, he's saying, well, since the bourgeoisie could steal the peasants' rebellions and make the bourgeois revolution out of it, then the statist rebellions could be ways of getting beyond that, even if the statist is a new form of exploitation, which he's not saying it isn't.
Right.
So he is doing what he seems to be making an ultra left point, and then at the very end he's doing the opposite, even though he's critiquing Dungism. Okay.
Very sly. Very sly.
It seems like he's trying to draw a lot of lines to draw it all together, like very disparate kind of I don't know. It's like, I guess I can kind of, if this is what he's doing, I can kind of appreciate the desire to draw everything in and say, hey, it's something different than what you thought it was.
All right.
I just feel like it would be more, it'd just be better if he said it outright.
All right. Well, we're almost done finally. We're on section 5, which is the last section, but then we get to even broader generalizations, although the generalizations that do have I mean, he's explicitly alluding to Marx without citing him. Only people make their own history. I mean, sometimes. Big asterisk on that, but I agree with it. But that, you know, this is the only people make their own history, but history is not of their own making. Like,
that's a hell of a caveat.
Yeah. Neither animals nor inanimate objects control their own evolution. They are subject to it. That's a little bit actually scientifically a bigger question on animals. If animals have technology, they have some control over their evolution. And we are not the only animals with technology. Sorry.
That's true.
The concept,
he needs to go back and read his Engels.
Yeah, he does actually. The concept of praxis is proper to society as an expression of the synthesis of determinism and human intervention. So praxis is the magic way out of the determinism economism problem. How? We're not going to say. And by the way, I'm not sure that Marx is actually clear on that either, but this is something you see in Marx.
Yeah.
The dialectic relation of infrastructure and superstructure is also proper to society and has no equivalent in nature.
Yeah, okay.
Sure. I mean, that we know of.
Yeah, but like, so what?
Yeah, like, so human things, cool, man. This relation is not unilateral. The superstructure is not the reflection of the needs of the infrastructure. If it were, society would always be alienated, and I cannot see how it could become liberated.
Okay, I mean, I agree with the basic gist.
I mean, it's basic Marxism, but it's Marxism at such a level that you can like squeeze almost anything into it. Like, this is all the highest level of abstractions of Marxism. This is not NCM prime. This is like the base and superstructure or feedback loop. Well, no shit. I hope.
Yeah, of course.
Unless you're economistic. I mean, this is like a good attack on like the productivism. But the thing is, right now, is the tradition which would be most likely to sign on to this are productivist.
Right.
I'm just confused. I'm confused at like who is even taking aim at here.
Yeah.
This is why I propose to distinguish between two qualitatively different types of transition from one mode to another. When the transition is made unconsciously or by alienated consciousness, that is, when the ideology animating the classes does not allow them to master the process of change, the later appears to be operating like natural change, the ideology being part of nature. For this type of transition, we can imply the expression mode of decadence. In contrast, if and only if the ideology expresses the total and real definition of desired change, we can speak of revolution. So he just made all prior revolutions non-revolutionary.
Yeah, he basically just contended that thus far there has not been a revolution except for socialism, and everything socialist is revolution, and everything else, like revolution as a concept, belongs to socialist ideology, not to the socialist proletariat, but to the socialist ideas,
right?
Only.
I don't understand what the point of any of this is. Like, this isn't clarifying. It's not.
No, it's revolutionary phrase mongering, in my opinion. But like, also, it makes it where we can say all prior revolutions, they're not revolutions, they're models of decadence.
Right.
I mean, I think that decadence is part of like what can be seen as a precursor to a revolutionary situation.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, if we go back to Lenin and actually talk about subjective and objective conditions needing to align, what brings them into alignment is decadence.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, so far, that's what all revolutions have been.
It is not just immiseration. It is the if we take Lenin, not Marx, by the way, Marx's immiseration thesis in Capital, Volume 1, chapter 25 and in the pre-1850 letters, but he doesn't seem to be later on. So make of that what you will. We are not people here to say that Marx is always consistent. I'm not of that kind of Marxist tradition, but I do think this is to label all non-intentional modes as models of decadence seems to me to just say that, like, okay, all the past is just a society decaying into another society. In which case, we can't speak of revolution because revolution is intentional. But then that would only apply to national liberation and socialist revolutions. But then national liberation isn't necessarily revolutionary because he said that it also has to change the mode of production, and national liberations do not inherently do that.
Right.
But
not
they would, though.
anyway.
Right. They would, though, if they had disalienated consciousness.
Right.
So this is kind of like what Trotskyists do when they determine whether or not something was a revolution or wasn't a revolution, right?
Yes.
It's where they not all Trotskyists. Okay, I often accidentally
not all
say when I say Trotskyists when I mean like Third Campus or Cliffites and
really
offshoots.
It's post 60s radicals.
Yeah, because Maoists do this too. Honestly,
right. It's like incorrect. Whatever. If it's got correct leadership, then it's a revolution. And if it doesn't have correct leadership or correct ideology, then it's not a revolution.
Right. So which like makes it all sectarian.
Right. Yeah. So like the Cliffites would say that basically the only socialist revolution that ever happened was the October Revolution.
Yeah, but only till 1921 or 1927 or whatever. Like,
yeah, depending on what kind of third campus you are, 21, 27, whatever.
Right. I mean,
there was one that was
1917. Like,
yeah, I don't remember which one it was though. One of the ultra left sects.
Yeah, I mean, it's weird to me that here's my thing about ideological variance in socialism that I get from a neo-cot, but I think it's actually an accurate description. The fact that I can come up with a Maoist, a Marxist-Leninist, and a Trotskyist position on everything that's identical but separate from each other, then the only difference is the revolutionary verbiage. And we can even see this, and I'm picking on the PSL, but we know the PSL comes from the Workers' War Party, and the Workers' War Party was a Marxist Trotskyist. It was a tanky Trotskyist group. And I use tanky here specifically in that they sided with Khrushchev in the crushing of the Hungarian uprising.
Right. They are, in fact, the reason why the term exists.
Right. And the Marxiites, however, did not abandon their Trotskyism until like the split between the WWP and the PSL happened. I mean, like, it's that late. So like 2004, so just 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I've been told by some people, if you get into the inner circles, they still believe in permanent revolution, even though they're Marxist-Leninists now. So, you know, I don't know if that's true. I'm not in the secret inner esoteric circles of the PSL, but I've been told that. All right.
Well, right. And good thing too.
So is a socialist revolution in which our era is engaged of a decadent or revolutionary type? Doubtless, we cannot answer this question definitely. In certain aspects, the transformation of the modern world is incontestably has a revolutionary character. Blah, blah, blah. Paris Commune revolutions in Russia and China, particularly the Cultural Revolution. Okay, so this is definitely not Dungist if you're celebrating the Cultural Revolution, because the Cultural Revolution is a hard thing for Dungist to deal with. Intense de-alienated social consciousness. But are we not engaged in another trapezoidism? The difficulty to make the disengagement of imperialist countries nearly inconceivable today, and the negative impact of the peripheral countries following the socialist road cause them to question the old Bolshevik model.
What are the peripheral countries following the socialist road? Like which countries?
Yeah, which ones?
I mean, Cuba and the DPRK are the only ones that have not market liberalized. And Cuba's market liberalized some, but like, and the DPRK's market liberalized some too, actually.
Right.
But like, because the DPRK had market liberalization and their relations with China and Russia. And Cuba has had like small market reintroduction, with co-op firms.
Right, and they even never really got rid of like single family or single employee.
Petit bourgeois shit's fine in Cuba.
Yeah.
Which honestly is why they didn't have like a mass dekulagization or anything that required a bunch of slaughter. That's why we like Cuba here. We're kind of we realize there are limitations to the Cuban Revolution, but
But
it's one of the ones that's easier to like celebrate. Clearly, DPRK is a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, I don't know how to square their weird sort of Confucian dynasty with Marxism.
Well, neither do they.
Yeah, and
that's why they officially say we're not so much Marxist-Leninist. We are a new thing, which is better than that.
Yeah, which is based on national autonomy.
Yeah,
because that was forced on us anyway.
Right. I mean, I recognize that the DPRK is a result of the country being bombed into the Stone Age and isolated and starved.
Yeah.
I do not fault them for their strangeness.
But I mean, other countries that have been bombed into the Stone Age, isolated and starved, go reactionary, and we would say that. I also know a lot about DPRK, and some of it's hard to defend, and some of it isn't.
I also just think I take the position that's the East German position, which is like these people are weird. Their philosophy is not recognizable to us. The Romanians, the Chinese, they have differences in what their version of communism, but the North Koreans are doing something else.
Right. I always point out that like Honecker and the DDR had weird relations with North Korea. Like basically the DDR declared themselves like non-hostile and like brothers and something, but the specific wording actually made it clear that they didn't see each other as like total comrades.
Right.
I'm trying to remember what the wording is, but it was very specific. When I talk about the DPRK, I'm kind of similar. Like, we need to leave it the fuck alone. Yeah, but like, I'm not celebrating it either. Like,
I'm happy they got nukes.
Yeah.
I'm happy they got nukes because it means they won't become the next Iraq anytime soon.
But also, may they never use them.
May they never use them. May mutually assured destruction keep working.
Yeah.
This is all tongue in cheek, by the way.
Yeah. Yes, but
actually yes.
Yeah, but actually also yes. Look, if the DPRK was to have an internal, relatively bloodless revolution, I honestly do think like there's been a massive change in production and orientation under Kim Jong-un, but it's so hard to talk about because we have so little access to what they're doing. But we do know that they have that part of how their economy has improved since 2014. They were still having famines before then. Was like integrating in some market stuff with China and Russia,
right?
And people who could get around the UN sanctions. But even that's pretty fucking limited.
Well, their economy's cranking now that they're selling all kinds of Cold War era weaponry to Russia to use in Ukraine,
and also sending troops there now.
Right. That's what I hear.
Well,
not sure.
They are sending troops there. That's been confirmed.
Yeah. But I mean, I don't doubt that they are. I'm not sure what the fuck that they're going to use them for. It's when you think about like combat doctrine integration and language barriers, and I don't know what they're going to actually be doing.
I don't know, but like it's not like throwing armies that can't communicate with each other and have different combat doctrines is unknown to the West either. So like,
no, but like when it comes to NATO,
it's also the case that like North Korea and Russia have long-standing military relations where they like send troops back and forth to like do training exercises and stuff.
right.
That's true. That's true.
In some
There's
ways,
actually a fairly large working
out, like,
population of North Koreans in Russia too, actually. So,
well, yeah, like some commentators have been like, I don't really know if this is even, like, yes, it's confirmed that they're North Korean troops, but like
it might not even be
5 years ago, they're also what it was. Right, exactly.
Right.
We just don't know.
We don't know.
Well, so North Koreans have like the most advanced system of tunnels and ground fortifications in the world. They've been developing it for like years, and that's partially why Hamas and Hezbollah had such good underground fortifications, is because they got like advisors from North Korea in the 2000s, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, maybe there's something to do with that going on in Russia, because I know they have been using like trench systems and like basically World War I tunneling to get underneath Ukrainian positions and like blow them up and then infiltrate them and stuff like that. So that would make sense to me.
Yeah, totally.
This is all speculation on my part, though.
We don't know, but there's stuff that makes. I will say this: Russia started winning a lot more when they went back, when they realized that the American style of warfare only really works when you don't care about hurting territory.
Right. They're like, now they're offensive, which you always talk about, like there being a culmination point of an offensive and then diminishing returns. But they've applied like steady pressure on like the entire front for like an entire year. With
However,
no culmination point. It's pretty wild.
That said, I mean, using Clausewitzian calculuses, I'm actually surprised Ukraine has lasted as long as it has.
I mean, it wouldn't have without all of the
weapons,
money weapons being dumped in by the West. But I think that like this is a war of attrition, and that's what it's set up to be now at this point. Like since 2023 anyway, it's a war of attrition.
Things get complicated if they actually win. Believe it or not, that's when things get a little bit uglier.
Yeah, I don't know what I can't conceive of what the end of this war looks like.
I don't think anyone else can either.
Right. And that's actually a problem for Russia. That's a big problem for Russia.
Because if you break like if you think about the US model, and people are like, oh, the US lost in Iraq. And I hate to tell people, no, it didn't. It failed. It didn't lose.
Right. It won.
The Iraqi forces did not beat the United States forces.
Right.
It had no clear objectives.
Right.
And it couldn't reestablish a good government there. That failed. Whereas it lost in Vietnam. Like I just want people to like look at. There's a difference between those set conditions. The United States won in neither category, but it lost in Vietnam. It failed in Iraq. And I guess it kind of lost in Afghanistan, but that's a even weirder scenario.
They lost a 20-year-long war of attrition.
Right. Well, but also because we wouldn't. I hate. I mean, this is gonna sound brutal, but because we weren't fighting a war of attrition, and they were.
Right. We didn't know we were fighting a war of attrition.
Like, because if we're fighting a war of attrition and we know that, we can weaken stuff really quickly.
So, I mean, part of the calculus that goes into grand strategy of a war is the termination point, right? Like what your war goals are, when you've achieved them, and when you know how to stop hostilities.
When's the last time we had a termination point on any fucking thing?
We have been strategy deficient like the Wehrmacht, basically, you know, for the past
Korean War.
Yeah, since the Korean War. Yeah, essentially, yeah. But also, like, the United States, amazingly, however, didn't take into consideration in with Afghanistan specifically that the attrition doesn't just apply to soldiers killed and weapons and machinery destroyed.
But civil society.
Civil society, exactly. Yeah. Which, that's a lesson we should have learned in Vietnam.
And yet we did not. I mean, but yeah, if you the problem with Iraq is there was no termination point. The problem with Afghanistan is also there was no termination point, but it actually led to a war of attrition on our proxies, which we allowed to just dissolve into nothing.
Right.
So, you know, I don't want to get like, these are semantic differences, but they kind of matter. And the reason why they kind of matter is like, I don't know, like I don't think Ukraine. I've been on team Ukraine can't win from moment one.
Oh, for sure.
That's not a moral judgment. Like, people have like listened to me talk about it. I think the West set it up, but what Putin did was still,
right,
you know, not wise. But they're fighting this war really well because they switched from the kind of style of warfare that we do, which they were trying to do in the beginning, right?
Right.
To World War II style Clausewitzian attrition and territory holding. And right. I do think go ahead.
They took a instead of trying to be, you know, doing Operation Desert Shield, you know, which is essentially what they were trying to do here. They were trying to do like a Gulf War type situation, like cause like a strike to the heart that caused a collapse and, you know, possibly a regime change. Didn't work, and so they decided to do you know, Rokossovsky instead, you know,
right,
or
which
Shukov, right,
which totally works.
Yep.
But you know, people would actually have to study warfare to understand this. The other
right.
thing, but
they switched from blitzkrieg to deep operations.
Right. The issue that you get, however, is that if you totally break the Ukrainian state, then you go into fourth generation warfare mode with irregulars, and things get a lot weirder.
Yeah.
Or you go into genocide mode, which I actually do not think they want to do. I mean, I really do believe like there's no evidence that they want to do that. If they wanted to do that, they could make Ukraine look like Gaza. They don't. So,
contrary to what all the anarcho-liberals that support Ukraine have to say, that is not what Russia wants to do.
No, and there's no. If they wanted to do that, they'd be carpet bombing Kyiv.
Right.
They aren't.
No.
So
they've been rather judicious, actually. Contra what you see in the media about civilian casualty, they've been actually judicious about the way that they've deployed their strikes. Even though, and I will admit this, you know, hands down here before someone calls me out on this later, any war in which you're relying heavily on artillery barrages is going
heavy
to have
civilian casualties.
Heavy civilian casualties. And that is definitely the case here.
Right. But they are not. It is still different than what you see in like Gaza, where you see like where you're bombing hospitals and schools first.
Right. And what you're seeing in Gaza is what Germany did to Warsaw in 1939.
Right. I was about to say, which is Germany, Warsaw, Germany and Belarus,
Germany and Minsk, and
Kiev,
in Kiev as well.
Hey,
we should move towards wrapping up.
Well, all right, we're almost done anyway. We're literally almost at the last set. Okay, so some people are resigned to believe this and believe that our time is not one of socialist transition, but a worldwide expansion of capitalism, which, starting from a little corner of Europe, is just beginning to extend south into the east. That was last century, dude. We're not there anymore. Capitalism's already done that, motherfucker. At the end of the transfer, the imperialist phase will have appeared not the last, but the highest stage of capitalism. We hope, but the central phase towards the universal capitalism. Even if it continues to believe that the Leninist theory of imperialism is true and that national liberation is part of the socialist and not of the bourgeois revolution, sorry, national liberation is part of both. would not be exceptions. That is, the appearance of the capitalist sinners be possible. This theory emphasizes the restorations or evolutions towards a status mode in the Eastern countries. This is he's got such a weird stance towards Dungism. He's like taking half of it and dropping the other half of it.
Yeah. So I think that, like, whenever I said earlier that the national liberation struggles were successful bourgeois revolutions, that does not mean that I don't think that in somewhere like Vietnam or China, there could be some sort of shuffling of social arrangements at the top of society that could implement socialism.
Right. We should be defensive. I get people mad at me because I say we should be critical, and I mean that seriously, not like either the MLs or the campus do.
Yeah.
We should be critical but supportive and defensive of China.
Yes, I absolutely agree.
Like, but we also have to be honest about where China is and not like blow smoke up people's asses. And particularly not make claims that even the Chinese state doesn't.
I know, right?
Capitalism. Similar with these other nationally existing socialist countries, but this is interesting because that also means you have to criticize, because which faction in these countries wins then really matters.
Yes,
because there are capital restorationist factions in all of these countries. Mm-hmm. Sorry, and we know it. Like. Particularly since they're all since the fall of the Soviet Union and the Sino-Soviet split, there is no non-socialist world, even BRICS, and we can be pro-BRICS if we want to be. But even BRICS has enough capitalist in it that you can't say that it's a non-capitalist organization.
Right.
Like,
I mean, it's only got what, like China and socialist.
Yeah.
Who else is in BRICS that is nominally socialist at very least?
I don't even know.
I don't think anyone is. For sure.
Brazil is not claiming, I mean, even though Lula claims to be a socialist, Brazil is not claiming to even kind of overcome capitalism.
Well, maybe the United Arab Emirates.
Sure. I mean, I don't know, man. Other in the standpoint of other, like, anyway. So even if one continues to believe that literacy, we've already read that. Those who hold the opinion believe we must wait until the level of development of productive forces at the center is capable of spreading to the entire world before the question of the abolition of classes can really be put to agenda. Other than the platypus affiliated society, who believes that?
Nobody this century.
I mean, it was the second international position.
Yeah, but
it was Plekhanov's position.
But that was early in the last century.
Yeah. And it was kind of Lenin's position sometimes, but not always.
Yeah. So let's say we'll be very generous and say this position that he's countering is only 100 years out of date.
Right.
Europeans should thus allow the creation of a supranational Europe so that the state superstructure can be adjusted to the productive forces. So he wants globalism and Europe and maybe America, but not imperialism. See, this is why he's
luck,
right? But I'm not. Maybe he doesn't want that actually. But this is. Europeans should thus allow for supranational Europe with the state structure can be adjusted to productive forces. It will doubtless be necessary to await the establishment of a planetary state corresponding to the level of productive forces on the world scale before the objective conditions superseding it will obtain. Others, myself among them, see things differently. Okay, good. Because I'm like, that's, I mean, I know people who think that, but it wouldn't be Europe either. It'd be the United States. The uninterrupted revolution by stages is still on the agenda for the periphery. Restoration in the course of the socialist transition are not irrevocable, and breaks in the imperialist front are not inconceivable in the weak lines of the center. All of which I agree with, but that says nothing about how they become socialist.
I was about to say, I agree with this paragraph, but with like no caveats except for it doesn't tell us anything.
This concluding paragraph by itself is great.
Yeah.
Except for I have one quibble, which is that rather than saying uninterrupted revolution by stages a couple of times in the article. What if you just said permanent revolution instead?
Shush, shush, shush. Don't get people to realize that permanent revolution actually isn't all that exotic, and it's just a phrasing of Trotsky, but does have pretty clear background. And even Stalin didn't totally disagree with it. He just didn't like the phrasing. Shush.
Right.
But my problem here, my problem here is like, I get an argument with anti-imperialists is like the first world should do nothing, and I'm like, you have to have more than anti-imperialism as your agenda, because there are fascists who are anti-imperialists, my friend. No, there aren't. It's just a Janus. It's just liberalism.
Nope.
There are liberals who are anti-imperialist too. So
yeah. I mean, and in the United States, I would say that most of the actual fascists in the United States, not just people that are meaner and also Republican, but actual fascists in the United States are anti-imperialist, because the milieu in which they like swim is one that you're familiar with, Derek. They're
hyper-nationalists. Yeah,
right. The paleocon right, and they're anti-imperialists as well.
I actually pointed out that the neo-Confederates were split between whatever those people who tried to go over and take over states in Latin America to expand slavery, freebooters, freejackers. I can't remember what they're called, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like Walker was one of them.
The vast Southern Empire people.
Right. But the other thing I point out is the neo-Confederates were also anti-imperialists too. They were split. They were either really for imperializing slavery, but there's this whole other tradition that leftists do not like to talk about, that were like opposed to the Mexican-American War because they thought that Mexico should be left alone because we didn't want all those brown people.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're like, empire equals integrating with brown people. We don't want that. That's what I was trying to explain to someone the other day.
Don't tell the British that.
Yeah.
But the thing is that is true. It just is.
Right.
Yeah.
This was the thing I was saying the other day to someone, and I was like, they're like, I don't understand how someone can be MAGA and pro-Palestinian. I'm like, I don't get it in terms of Trump's actual Israel policy, but I totally get it in terms of, Palestinians should have their own nation and we should protect it, but also they should stay the fuck away from here. Like, that's a consistent point of view.
Like, I have a friend who's Syrian and opposes Syrian refugees being allowed into the United States. And I asked him why, and he said because they need to stay in Syria and fix Syria because they're Syrians. They shouldn't be leaving Syria.
But then you go, like, why are you here, motherfucker? But nonetheless, I mean, like, there is a way you could do this. And I think, like, this idea that anti-imperialism, and the other thing is just automatically progressive is not true. That doesn't mean we should shun it. That does mean sometimes we have to accept that there's going to be reactionary people in our movement, right? Like,
it's going to happen.
Yeah. And that's okay. And honestly, this is where I'm neither with the let's tell the right or let's kick everybody who doesn't, like, all the people who complain about, what was it, the Teamsters being speaking at the Trump, even though they didn't endorse Trump ultimately, but the tell of the two Seans, as I like to mention it. It seems pretty clear to me that, like, Sean Fain is subject to the Democratic Party for obvious reasons because of industrial policy, and Sean O'Brien is in a place that has more strategic significance and is allowed to do whatever, but also might end up being kind of nationalist too. But they're both forms of nationalism, and in the core, it is weird to promote nationalism. Like even if you take this core periphery stuff seriously, promoting nationalism in the core is kind of crazy. But if you're just anti-imperialist, you could do that. So I'm like, you have to have more substance than that. And they're like, well, ending a genocide is enough. And then the guy I saw this was like, I'm a leftist and I'm anti-imperialist, but I'm also a bio-regionalist. And I'm like, get out. Yeah,
there's a whole I guess I haven't heard from much about them in a while, but in the early 2000s, there were a bunch of like anarcho primitivist types that were like borderline fascist in their bioregionalism.
Yeah, there were bioregionalists who, like the guy who wrote the book, the good book on the Luddites, who also was a bioregionalist who was like also willing to work with neo-Confederates and shit. I mean, like, now the advent of the return of Jay Sakai has makes that a little bit more complicated. But the thing is, like, I actually am not going to say Samir Amin doesn't have this, but it seems to me that both the we only do things in the first world and we'll spread it out position, which, by the way, we should have already been able to meet the, like, Engels says that by 1880 we had the conditions to have socialism. So, like, just want to put that out there. So the productive forces argument is weird, but also
isn't that a position of like the MAGA communists?
Yes, it is. Yeah. We need a national revolution in the core because reasons. But then the other position that I like sort of struggle with is, I'm like, how do you think the third world revolutions are going to overcome the productive forces of a hostile developing world?
Well, they just don't think that.
Right. So what is it? So it seems like instead of like, the only revolutionary force is going to be in the third world, you got to have something for them to hook up with. Just like the socialists have to hook up with the working class, the developing world and the developed world, socialist and working class, need to be on the same fucking team. Like, now that doesn't mean that we should support or not support like neoliberal globalization. Obviously we shouldn't, but it just seems to me like saying that there's no role for the proletariat and also socialist in the developed world. That just seems like dumb. Like, I mean, like, we have to have, like, one, we need to stop our own imperial projects. I agree with him. That's something we can do. But two, we need to develop socialist frameworks and stuff here to join up with there, even if the mode of production is more possible there, because they're going to need our resources. If that wasn't true, China wouldn't take the developmental path it took in the 1980s. I'm sorry. Like, so I don't know, man. And none of this, I just want to say at the end, none of this is what we mean by decadence. I don't think decadence is just an unintentional revolution versus an intentional one.
So, like, is it decadence theory?
No. Or like he has, this has, what I find interesting is this has nothing to do with the standard meaning of decadence, nor does it have anything to do with the various socialist meanings of decadence, which are tied into like modes of production and profit rates and shit.
Right.
Like, there's no discussion of profits or anything in here.
I like how in this series on decadence theory, we spent 3 episodes talking about something that we ultimately decide doesn't have anything to do with decadence theory.
I mean,
but it's an influential piece, though, so it's definitely something that we should deal with, right?
It's interesting how Samir is super important and still cited, but it's interesting to me that this did not get picked up, because even the monthly review socialists have gone a different route.
Right. And this is actually something that we dealt with less critically earlier, because we included it in a me and Jason and I guess Kevin. Kevin. And we included it into a bigger group of readings and dealt with it all in a 1-hour episode. Whereas in this one, we're breaking it down much more slowly and critically.
Yeah, I mean, there's stuff to like in this. I know we were really harsh on it in the beginning, and people who listen to From Dawn to Decadence Part 2 are going to hear me tear this apart. Whereas this one, I'm like, I think I agree with this, but maybe the order of operations is wrong. Or I think I agree with this, but like this last part, what are we supposed to do in the core?
Yeah, that's my biggest problem with third worldism, is that the most powerful and productive countries in the world have the working classes of those have no role to play whatsoever.
I mean, this isn't the kind of third worldism that's like there's no proletariat in the first world. I mean, Samir Amin isn't that kind of third worldist, and
Right.
I give him credit for that. He's not saying there's no exploitation in the developed world. So he's actually a step above the kind of like the Leading Lights Communist Organization or Marxist internationalist Maoism. For those of you who don't know, there's like 5 kinds of Maoism.
Oh my god!
Like,
I miss the MIM guys.
Yeah.
There was a guy in Austin in the
they
early
hated
2000s.
everything.
Yeah.
Oh man.
They used to. You remember this guy, Jason? This just absolute weirdo that would show up and drop off the newspapers in bookstores and stuff like that. Just the strangest person you've ever seen. Never had a conversation with him. You just see him every once in a while when you're in an independent bookstore dropping off the MIM newspapers.
Right. I remember the MIMers in the Leading Lights Communist Organization went to say that labor theory of value had nothing to say, so they could maintain their idea that their productivity had nothing to do with the fact that there was no exploited proletariat in the developed world at all.
Yep.
Like, so I want to give Samir Amin a lot of credit, but his theory, like, okay, so this is set up so we can choose decadence, which is an accidental shift into another mode of production. I guess a tributary one, right? If I actually iron out what he's saying here, or we can choose socialism, but then who's doing the choosing? Because it doesn't seem like there's anything for the developed world to do, or he actually doesn't say that, but he doesn't give us any idea what we should be doing, like, except for maybe fighting imperialism, maybe, which again, I agree, but I don't think that's all we should be doing. Like, I'm not a pro-imperial leftist. That's such a weird. There are people who believe it, or at least the Platypus Affiliated Society would deny that they're pro-imperial. They are somewhere between imperial and anti-imperial, whatever the fuck that means. But
I don't think there's really very much of a between.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. Like, campism kind of made sense when there's a non-aligned movement or something.
Well, even just when there were camps,
right?
I could see why you would say even if there was not a third camp, you could at least wish that there was.
Well, I mean, they're kind of what I mean. Ironically, it wasn't the Trotskyists who were arguably third campists; it was the Maoists.
Yeah.
But because siding with the unaligned movement versus the socialist movement, that would be a third camp,
right?
I mean, this is the thing. Most campism in the Cliffite tradition seems to be an excuse to support the imperial core. I agree with that. Unfortunately, it's come to dominate Trotskyism so much that Trotskyist anti-imperialism has been written out of history, and that was very real. But the other thing is, this stuff is still very vague, because I think if I ask 2 Marxist-Leninists today what they mean by anti-imperialist, I get radically different answers.
Yeah.
Like,
that's something that we've been wanting to talk about for a while, is what is the definition of imperialism, and how, as a Marxist now, can one be anti-imperialist, and what does that mean?
Yeah, I still want to do that.
Yeah.
Like, we all know that we shouldn't support NATO, I hope. Sorry, people. Anarcho-liberals and the few former Cliffites that are in the world. But beyond that, that's one prohibition, right?
Right.
And even how we don't support NATO seems to be very different. And I've often pointed out that, like, American imperialism often works better when it's not operating militarily, even though it's based on the huge military industrial apparatus. But whenever Europe gets out of line, we get them in line with economic incentives, not with military ones.
Yeah, the American empire has definitely utilized soft power much more effectively than it has utilized its military. That is absolutely true.
We haven't been hard power strong since World War II, probably. But the 19th century was our hard power century. Well, let me put it.
There is a gray area there where assassinations and coups mixed with soft power end up being pretty successful in a lot of instances.
But we don't do that many assassinations anymore either. We do coups.
No. Not anymore. Yeah, we do coups, but I don't necessarily know how successful they are. Like El Salvador.
Libya seems to have backed up, not gone the way anyone wanted.
The same thing with El Salvador as well, right?
Yeah.
And Bolivia, that didn't work out for them. And even I won't necessarily say that Maidan was engineered by the United States so much as it was just seized upon by the United States. But that didn't seem to work out for anyone either.
I also say I think Maidan has a lot. I think it was seized upon by the United States, but I think it actually was more set up by Europe than the U.S. I don't think the U.S. was actually paying that much attention.
Yeah, it was definitely on the ground as soon as it happened, though.
Absolutely.
As soon as Maidan happened, you had U.S. intelligence was just lousy in Ukraine.
I'll be quite fair. As soon as there's an interruption anywhere, U.S. intelligence is already on both sides. I mean, that's usually what they do. But I don't want to say that what I won't say is Maidan was engineered, because talking to people in Ukraine, it does seem like it developed organically from a setup that Merkel saying that Yushchenko, what's his name? Yushchenko?
The former
Yushchenko. Yeah. The Yushchenko
wait a minute. Is it Yanukovych?
Yanukovych is who you're thinking of. Yeah.
Yes, Yanukovych. Okay. Yeah.
You're thinking Yevtushenko, right?
Yes.
No.
I got to keep my Shinkos and Koviches apart. No, I was like, Yanukovych is like ability to join the EU but also stay in the Eurasian Union was scuttled by Germany. And that's what prompted Maidan.
So Viktor Yushchenko was prime minister before Yanukovych.
Okay, yes. I get my Shinkos and Koviches confused.
You weren't quite as confused as all that, though.
All them Shenkos and Dankoviches and whatever.
Well, I mean, usually the Shinkos actually indicate a certain part of Ukraine, and the Koviches indicate a certain part of Ukraine. So, but nonetheless, I mean,
what about the Chuks? Where do the Chuks come from?
I don't know. Are the Zelenskys, which is also confusing because there's a similar name on the Russian side.
Right.
No, I don't want to sound unsympathetic to the Ukrainian plight. I actually don't.
No, they've been screwed around from both sides since their inception.
And my biggest moment of mistaken punditry was thinking that like Zelensky wouldn't play into NATO. In some ways, he doesn't have a choice, not just because of needing weapons, but also because his right would kill him. But
I don't necessarily know if that's true anymore, because I think that there's been a lot of initially, that was absolutely true, but there's been a lot of pro ceasefire sentiment coming from even like Azovite circles, you know?
Yeah, because they know they're going to lose.
Yeah, but Zelensky will not stay in power if the war ends. So I think that he's going to probably prolong the war for as long as possible.
Gonna ride it all the way into the ground.
Here's the thing: is I think I think the West is going to pivot. What it might not pivot as quickly with Harris versus Trump, and we're recording like 3 days before the election, but it's gonna pivot. Like it particularly if I can see us like trying to set up something like where they can go after Iran or whatever, they're not going to give a shit about what's going on in Ukraine.
For sure.
But I'm going to say all this with a grain of salt, because everything, if we've tried to predict the future on any of these geopolitical stuff, we've all been wrong on part of it. So
I wrote a paper though, about a year and a half ago, predicting exactly what has happened in Ukraine. And that happened. So like, there's one thing I got right, but I don't think that takes like a magician to figure that out.
No, I think you just follow Eastern European stuff for a variety of reasons.
And this was for a military strategy class that I was taking. So like, you know, I follow military things and Eastern European things.
My actual initial prediction was that the Ukrainian government would fall and this would become a fourth generation war quicker than it has. And that's actually partly because of Russian, and I'm going to get called a Russia apologist, but it's partly because of Russian restraint. And I think if you look at what's going on in the Middle East versus you look at what's going on in Russia, even in terms of like, not just in terms of Israel, Palestine, but like Turkey versus Kurdistan or whatever,
right?
It starts becoming clear that like Russia actually is respecting rules of war.
Or Syria versus itself.
Yeah.
Right?
For the last fucking 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
Also, and everyone else versus Syria versus itself, because Syria has
Yeah.
been used as a pincushion for bombs for a decade now.
And you have to, and while it is absolutely true that Russia has targeted civilian infrastructure throughout the war, which is a war crime and it's bad and definitely should not happen, it is standard operating procedure for the United States and all of its NATO allies when they go into, say, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Yeah, exactly.
Here's the thing. I hate to tell people, but you can't fight war without committing war crimes.
No.
Yeah.
What did General Sherman say about it? That war is hell, and any attempt to make it less so is a good way to lose, or whatever. I'm paraphrasing here.
Or to make it worse, because you're just going to drag it out longer.
Yeah.
Like, well, now I know you can use that in bad faith, and like, look, the one thing I worry about is all these wars dragging out way longer than anyone wants them to. I mean, like, the last thing I want to see is like Eastern Europe go out fucking like Afghanistan, and we're still talking about this in 20 years.
Right.
But
I mean, just like the immiseration of the Ukrainian people, you really have to feel bad for them.
No,
you really have to feel bad for them being used as a cat's paw to weaken Russia openly by the United States. You know,
right?
Yeah.
And they're like their society's collapsing. Their soldiers are deserting.
Yeah.
En masse. There's like
for the opposite reasons of why people are deserting in Israel, where like, you know, killing children actually does take a toll on you.
Right.
It's a bummer. Yeah. Hey, I gotta go.
Yeah, let's end this.
Yes, I have to go too. I can hear
on that note,
the bathwater running. Baby's about to get in.
All right. Let us end this conversation, and we will do this again at some uninterrupted time, and we'll actually talk about the history of at least the socialist form of decadence theory, as opposed to whatever this was. All right. Bye-bye.